They say bungee jumping changes you, that it's a rush like no other, a plummet into the void that ends with a snap back to life. This is what drove her to it. Clara had always been afraid of heights, the kind of fear that sends chills up your spine just thinking about standing near the edge of anything taller than 2 stories. And it wasn't just the fear itself, it was the way it chained her, how it seeped into everything she did or didn't do. Heights were only a symptom of a larger problem. Fear had gripped Clara her whole life. Fear of failing, of being judged, of losing control. So when her best friend Lucy posted that video from her own bungee jump on Instagram, standing proudly at the edge of that towering bridge, Clara felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Lucy's face was glowing, her laugh pure exhilaration as she threw herself off the edge like it was nothing. But Clara could barely watch. She quickly scrolled past the video, her palms suddenly damp. Clara didn't sleep well that night. The image of Lucy's jump replayed in her mind over and over, and with it came the guilt. Lucy had faced her fear, but Clara? She was still trapped. What was wrong with her? Was she always going to be stuck in this cycle of avoiding, running away, hiding? By the next morning, Clara had made her decision. She was done being ruled by fear. She would do it. She would take the plunge and throw herself off that same bridge, tethered to nothing but a cord. No backing down this time. If she could survive that, maybe she could survive anything. The day of the jump arrived faster than she had expected. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood by the edge of the bridge, staring down at the river far, far below. The water glittered in the sunlight, deceptively peaceful. The wind was stronger up here than she'd anticipated, tugging at her hair, making everything feel slightly more precarious. The creak of the suspension bridge beneath her feet didn't help. "You ready?" The instructor's voice cut through her racing thoughts. He was cheerful, as if this were nothing more than a casual Sunday hike. He'd done this hundreds of times, probably thousands. To him, it was routine. Clara swallowed, her mouth dry. "Yeah, I think so." "You're gonna be fine," he assured her, his tone calm and confident. "Just remember, once you're out there, don't look down. Look straight ahead. Focus on the horizon." She nodded mechanically. Her hands were shaking as she double-checked the harness they'd strapped around her waist. The rope was thick, coiled like a snake at her feet, ready to uncoil in a sudden, violent drop. She had watched them secure it, felt the tug as they tightened the knots. Everything was in place. She took a deep breath. This was it. Clara's friend Lucy had come along for moral support, standing at the side with her phone ready to record the whole thing. She smiled and waved, mouthing the words, "You got this." But Clara wasn't so sure. As she stepped toward the edge of the platform, her legs felt like lead. The view from up here was worse than she could have imagined. The drop was dizzying, the river below a narrow ribbon of blue. Her chest tightened. She forced herself to breathe. The instructor gave her one last pat on the shoulder. "You're gonna feel like you're flying. Just trust the cord." She nodded, but the pit in her stomach was only growing deeper. On the count of 3, the instructor said, stepping back. 1. Clara's heart thudded in her ears. "I can do this. I can do this." 2. "I'll be fine. It's safe. People do this all the time." 3. She jumped. The wind screamed in her ears, rushing past her as she fell. For a split second, she felt weightless, like she was floating in a void. The air tore at her clothes, her hair whipping around her face. Then came the rush. The sheer terror of free fall gripped her insides, but there was also something else, an exhilarating freedom, a release. She had done it. She was falling. She was. The snap never came. Something was wrong. There was no tug, no tension in the cord. Instead, Clara felt a sickening drop, her body accelerating as the river rushed up to meet her. She screamed, her voice lost in the wind. She barely had time to register what was happening before the icy water swallowed her whole. The impact was brutal, her body slamming into the river like she'd hit concrete. Everything went black for a moment, the cold, the pain, the confusion all overwhelming her senses. Then she was floating, the current gently pulling her downstream. Am I alive? Her eyes fluttered open, her body aching in ways she didn't know were possible. She gasped for air, the world spinning around her as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The harness was still attached to her, the rope trailing behind her in the water like a lifeless, useless tether. She was supposed to be hanging by that rope, not floating in the river with broken bones. What has gone wrong? The pain in her arm was sharp, blinding. She could barely move it. Something was definitely broken. Her leg too. Maybe her ribs. She couldn't tell, not in the chaos of the moment. Her head throbbed, the cold water making everything worse. She was lucky to be alive. That much was clear. But how? Had the rope snapped? Had they miscalculated the length? She couldn't wrap her mind around it. All she knew was that the jump had gone horribly wrong. The river's current was dragging her toward the bank now, and she tried to focus on that, on getting to solid ground. Her limbs were heavy, uncooperative. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body, but she had no choice. She couldn't just float there. When Clara woke up again, it was in the sterile white of a hospital room. Her body was wrapped in bandages, her legs suspended in a cast. She tried to move, but the pain was immediate, sharp enough to make her gasp. "Hey, easy there," a voice said gently. It was Lucy, sitting beside the bed, looking pale and shaken. "What? What happened?" Clara croaked, her throat dry. Lucy's face was tight with concern. "They're still figuring it out. Something went wrong with the rope. It snapped, I think. Or it was cut." Clara's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Lucy hesitated, glancing toward the door. "They're investigating. It shouldn't have happened, Clara. You were lucky to hit the water. If you'd fallen onto the rocks." Clara didn't need her to finish that sentence. She could imagine the alternative all too well. In the days that followed, Clara pieced together the details of the accident. The rope had indeed been severed, not snapped, but cut clean through. Authorities had launched an investigation, but so far, no one had answers. The company swore up and down that their equipment had been checked, that there had been no reason for the rope to fail. But it failed. Clara lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. Has someone tampered with the rope? But why? Who would do such a thing? It didn't make any sense. She had been just another customer, a scared girl trying to conquer her fear. And yet something or someone had almost killed her. As the weeks passed and Clara began her slow recovery, the fear she'd hoped to conquer returned, stronger than ever. It wasn't just the fear of heights anymore. It was something deeper, something darker. The sense that the world wasn't as safe as she'd thought. That people, even strangers, could be cruel in ways she couldn't understand. Every night, she dreamed of the fall. The sensation of the wind tearing at her skin, the gut-wrenching realization that the cord wasn't going to catch her, the cold, unforgiving embrace of the river. Clara had survived. But the fear? The fear would never let her go. Months later, long after the investigation had closed with no real answers, Clara stood on that same bridge again. She stared down at the river, the memories washing over her. She hadn't wanted to come back, but something had drawn her here. Maybe it was the need for closure, or maybe it was the lingering question that had haunted her ever since. Why? The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of rushing water. She stepped closer to the edge, her heart pounding in her chest,